You're standing in your kitchen, staring at a nearly empty cupboard, and the money in your pocket has to stretch further than it ever has before. You think there's nothing left to make, but there is. There are 25 meals that kept millions of Americans alive through the worst decade this country ever faced, and most of them cost less than a single cup of coffee today. Here's what stopped me cold. These meals weren't just survival food. They were clever, filling, and in some cases better than what we eat now, and they were deliberately forgotten because remembering them meant fewer dollars flowing to the people who feed us. I found the proof in a stack of Federal Writers Project interviews from 1938, recorded testimonies sitting in a university archive, and I promise you by the end of this I'll hand you the one recipe that a woman in rural Kentucky swore kept her 7 children fed on almost nothing. You don't need land, you don't need savings, you need a stove and about 20 minutes. I want to tell you how this started for me. I'm not a historian. I'm just an older man who noticed that the grocery bill that used to run me $60 was suddenly running me $140, and my income hadn't moved an inch. I got angry. Then I got curious. And curiosity turned into something close to obsession the night I sat at my kitchen table with a photocopied bulletin from the United States Department of Agriculture, dated 1933, and read a single line that made me put my coffee down. It said the average family could eat for 11 cents a day. 11 cents. I didn't believe it. So I started digging, and what I found changed the way I feed myself. Let me walk you through it, because every one of these meals is real, tested, and waiting for you. The first thing I pulled from the record was something they called the poor man's meal, and it stopped me because it was so simple I assumed I'd misread it. 1 potato, 1 onion, a few slices of the cheapest cut of hot dog or bologna you could find. You fry the diced potato in a little fat until it browns, throw in the onion, then the sliced meat, and you let it all crisp together in one pan. That's it. I found this described almost word for word in oral histories collected across the Midwest, and the reason it survived is that it hit every note a hungry body needs: starch, fat, and a little protein, for pennies. I made it myself the first week. It fed me for 2 days and cost me less than $1.50 at today's prices. But here's what nagged at me. If something this cheap and this filling existed, why had I never once heard my own mother mention it? Somebody, somewhere, wanted this gone, and that question only got louder the deeper I went, because the next thing I found wasn't a meal at all. It was a trick. They called it milk toast, and when I first read the name, I nearly skipped it. It sounded like nothing, like something you'd feed a sick child. Then I read the context. During the leanest stretch of the 1930s, families would take stale bread, the bread that would otherwise be thrown out, toast it hard, then pour hot milk seasoned with a little butter, salt, and sometimes a spoon of sugar over the top. The stale bread drank up the warm milk and turned into something soft, hot, and comforting on a cold morning when there was nothing else. A woman interviewed for a state historical project remembered eating it before school and said she never once felt poor eating it because it was warm and it was hers. That's the part that got me. These weren't just calories, they were dignity. And somebody profited enormously from convincing us that dignity requires a full grocery cart. Hold that thought, because it gets worse before it gets better. Now I want to show you the one that made me realize how clever these people actually were. You've heard of apple pie, but what happens when you can't afford apples, or there are no apples to be had for 100 miles because you're living in a dust-choked town in 1934? You make mock apple pie, and here's the thing that floored me. They made it out of crackers. Plain broken soda crackers, boiled in water with sugar, a good dose of cream of tartar, cinnamon, and a squeeze of lemon. The cream of tartar gave it that tart apple bite. The crackers softened into something that held together like cooked fruit, and when you baked it in a crust, grown men swore they couldn't tell the difference. I thought this was a joke until I found the exact recipe printed on the back of cracker boxes later in the decade, which tells you the manufacturers knew people were doing it. Think about that. The record of our own ingenuity was printed and then quietly erased. But mock apple pie was only the beginning of what they could fake, and the next one is even harder to believe. Because if you can fake apples, it turns out you can fake almost anything with a little sugar and vinegar. That brings me to vinegar pie and water pie, two desserts that sound like punishment and taste like heaven. Water pie is exactly what it sounds like. You pour water into a pie crust, then flour, sugar, a little butter, and vanilla, and something almost magical happens in the oven. The starch and sugar and fat bind together as it bakes into a custard-like filling, golden and sweet, out of nothing but pantry staples and water. Vinegar pie works the same way, using apple cider vinegar to mimic the tang of citrus that most poor families couldn't afford or find. I made the water pie on a Sunday afternoon, half expecting to throw it out, and I ate 2 slices standing at the counter. It cost me maybe 40 cents. Now here's where the stakes rise, because I started asking myself a harder question. If people could make dessert out of water, what were they doing for real, everyday dinners? And the answer led me straight into the heart of the hardest years. Set your expectations aside, because the next meal was named after a president, and not out of affection. They called it Hoover stew. In the shanty towns that sprang up on the edges of American cities, the settlements people bitterly named Hoovervilles, families pooled whatever they had into one pot. Hoover stew was sliced hot dogs, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables anyone could scrape together, usually canned corn or beans, all simmered into a thick, filling stew that could feed a crowd and stretch for days. I found references to it in newspaper accounts and relief worker notes from the early 1930s, and what struck me was how community-driven it was. One family had the pasta, another had a can of tomatoes, a third had the sausage. Alone, none of them could make a meal. Together, they all ate. That was the secret nobody sells you today, because there's no profit in teaching people to pool what they have. There's only profit in selling each of us our own separate, expensive, single-serving convenience. And that realization is exactly when I stopped seeing this as history and started seeing it as something that had been taken from me on purpose. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because the vegetables in that stew opened up a whole world I never expected. Here's a question. What did people eat when the store shelves were bare and the garden hadn't come in yet? They ate the yard. I don't mean that as a joke. Dandelion greens were a springtime staple, gathered by the basketful before the flowers bloomed, boiled to cut the bitterness, then fried with a little bacon grease and onion. A Federal Nutrition Bulletin from the era actually praised wild greens for their vitamins, and modern science backs that up completely, because dandelion greens carry more vitamin A than most things you'll buy in a produce aisle. They also ate poke salad, purslane, lamb's quarters, the plants we now spray poison on and call weeds. A man in an Appalachian oral history said his family never bought a single leaf of greens in spring because the hills gave them away for free. Free food, growing on the ground, and today most people would step right over it without a clue what they were walking past. That's not an accident. Somebody made very sure we forgot how to look down. And once I understood that, The meals stopped being recipes and started being evidence. Let me give you the humble hero of the whole decade, the food that showed up more than any other in every record I read. Beans. Dried beans, specifically. Pinto beans, navy beans, whatever was cheapest by the sack. A pound of dried beans cost pennies then and costs very little now, and it swells to feed a whole family. But the trick I found wasn't just eating beans, it was the ham bone. Families would buy or save a single ham bone, one bone, and simmer it with a pot of beans for hours, and that one bone flavored enough food to feed a household for 2 or 3 days. Cornbread on the side, made from cornmeal, water, salt, and a little fat, and you had a complete hot protein-rich meal for almost nothing. I read a testimony from a woman in Georgia who said the smell of beans and a ham bone on the stove meant everything was going to be all right. That's the emotional truth of it. But there's a technical truth, too. And it's the reason I want you to keep listening, and it's also why I put everything I found into a book called Depression Proof. If you want every one of these recipes written out clearly, with the sourcing, the context, and the exact techniques these families used, it's all in Depression Kitchen, the book I put together from years of digging through these records. Everything I'm walking you through today is in there, tested and organized so you can use it starting this week. You can find it linked in the description below. Now, before I go further, I need to stop and talk to you directly, because I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking this all sounds fine for somebody with a garden, a big kitchen, a chest freezer, and time on their hands. You're thinking you live in a small apartment on a fixed check, that your knees don't let you go foraging in fields, that you can't cook for a crowd because it's just you. I want you to hear me. This next part is built for exactly your situation, and it's the part I wish someone had handed me 2 years ago when I was standing in my own small kitchen doing math I didn't like. Because the single most powerful thing I found in all these records doesn't require land, or money, or a strong back. It requires one pot and a habit. It's this. They cooked once and ate for days, and they wasted absolutely nothing. Here's how you do it this week. Starting today, in the smallest kitchen with the tightest budget, you buy 1 bag of dried beans, 1 onion, a sack of rice, and a small amount of the cheapest smoked meat you can find, even just a smoked turkey wing or a packet of bacon ends. On Sunday you cook the whole bag of beans in 1 big pot. That 1 pot becomes beans and rice on Monday. On Tuesday you mash the leftover beans, fry them flat in a pan, and now they're refried beans on toast. On Wednesday you thin what's left with water and a can of tomatoes, and it's soup. $1 worth of dried beans, cooked 1 time, becoming 3 or 4 different meals, so your body and your spirit don't get bored. The Depression cooks called this stretching, and the whole philosophy was that a thing wasn't finished until it had been used 3 times. Save the water you boil vegetables in, because that's free broth. Save every scrap of fat, because that's your cooking oil. Save the stale bread, because that's tomorrow's milk toast or bread pudding. You don't need a homestead. You need to stop throwing away the second and third life of everything you buy. And once you start seeing food that way, you'll be furious at how much you've been quietly trained to waste. Which brings me to the meals they built specifically to hide the fact that there wasn't much there. Creamed chipped beef on toast is one you may have heard old soldiers grumble about, but its roots run straight through the Depression kitchen. A small amount of dried salted beef, torn into pieces, cooked into a simple white gravy of flour, fat, and milk, then poured over toast. A few ounces of meat could cover 4 plates because the gravy did the heavy lifting. That's the genius of gravy in these records. Gravy is how you take a little protein and make it stretch across a whole family, because the flour and milk carry the flavor everywhere. I found the same principle in tomato gravy, where a can of tomatoes and a spoon of flour became a rich sauce over biscuits, and in red-eye gravy made from a little ham fat and black coffee poured into the pan. Coffee in the gravy. And it worked, giving a salty, deep flavor to the cheapest slice of ham. Every one of these was designed around a single idea, that the sauce should always outlast the meat. Nobody teaches that anymore, and I think I finally understand why, but I'm not ready to say it out loud yet, because I want you to see the full picture first. Let me show you what they did with the humblest ingredient in any kitchen. The potato. There's a dish in the records that people called potato soup, but calling it soup undersells it. Diced potatoes, an onion, milk, a little butter, salt and pepper, simmered until the potatoes half dissolve and thicken the whole pot on their own. No stock needed, no meat needed. A family could eat a pot of it for the cost of a few potatoes and a splash of milk. Then there were potato pancakes, made from leftover mashed potato mixed with a little flour and fried in a hot pan until crisp, turning last night's side dish into today's main course. And when the milk ran out, they made potato water gravy using the starchy water the potatoes boiled in as the base for a gravy that cost nothing at all. I keep coming back to that word, nothing. Over and over in these documents, people made something out of nothing, and they did it with such skill that their children remembered the food fondly for the rest of their lives. That's not deprivation, that's mastery. And it made me start to wonder who benefits when a whole nation forgets how to turn nothing into a good meal. Because there was a whole category of these dishes that existed purely to fill the belly cheaply, and they were shameless about it. Onions. Fried onion sandwiches were real, and they were common. 2 slices of bread, a thick layer of onions fried soft and sweet in a little fat, salt and pepper, and that was lunch. Ketchup sandwiches too, and mustard sandwiches, when there was truly nothing else. Just bread and condiment to quiet a growling stomach until the next meal. I'll be honest, those 2 hurt to read, because they mark the very bottom of what people endured. But even there, at the bottom, I found ingenuity, because families would fry the onion sandwich in the pan to make it hot and satisfying rather than eating it cold. And that small effort turned survival back into something like a meal. There's a lesson buried in that, and it's the same one that runs through every single thing I found. The difference between suffering and getting by was almost never the amount of food. It was the knowledge of what to do with it, and that knowledge I was starting to realize didn't just fade away on its own. Let me tell you about the sweets, because even in the hardest times, people needed something sweet, and what they invented is astonishing. There's a cake in these records with no eggs, no milk, and no butter. They called it various things, but many families called it war cake or crazy cake, and it later became famous as depression cake. You mix flour, sugar, water, a little oil or melted fat, cocoa if you had it, vinegar, and baking soda directly in the pan, and the vinegar and soda react to make it rise without a single egg. It comes out moist and rich and keeps for days without refrigeration, which mattered enormously when almost nobody had a reliable icebox. I made this cake, and I brought it to a family gathering without telling anyone what it was, and every slice disappeared. Not one person guessed there wasn't an egg or a drop of milk in it. That recipe survived because it was too good to die, passed hand to hand in church cookbooks and recipe cards, while the official food economy pretended it never existed. And that's really the pattern of this entire story. The best of this knowledge didn't survive in textbooks. It survived in whispers, in handwritten cards tucked into drawers, in the memories of women who are mostly gone now. Which means every year, more of it disappears for good. Now I need to show you the cornmeal dishes, because corn was king when money was scarce. Cornmeal mush was breakfast for millions. You cook cornmeal in boiling salted water until it thickens into a hot porridge, eat it warm with a little milk or molasses, and here's the clever part, you pour the leftovers into a loaf pan overnight. By morning it's set solid. You slice it, fry the slices in a hot pan until they're crisp and golden, and now it's fried mush, a completely different meal from the same pot of cornmeal. One cooking, 2 meals, almost no cost. They called this fried cornmeal mush, and in some regions scrapple when a little meat was added, and it fueled farm families through brutal mornings of physical work. I tried it, and I was amazed at how filling it was, how long it held me. This is the same stretching principle again, the same refusal to let anything be used only once. And by now you might be feeling the same thing I felt, a slow building anger. Because if this knowledge is this good and this cheap, somebody had to work hard to make sure we lost it. So let me finally tell you what I found about that. Here's the part of my investigation that changed everything, and I want you to sit with it. As I read deeper into agricultural bulletins and household economy manuals from the 1920s and 30s, I noticed something. In those years, the government and the extension services were actively teaching people how to cook from scratch, how to preserve, how to stretch, how to waste nothing. There were pamphlets, radio programs, home demonstration agents traveling county to county. Then, in the decades after the war, that all changed. The same institutions that once taught thrift began teaching convenience. Buy the boxed mix. Buy the frozen dinner. Buy the can that does it for you. And a whole generation, my parents' generation, was gently, deliberately steered away from the skills their own parents had used to survive. Not because those skills stopped working. They never stopped working. But because there is enormous money in a population that has forgotten how to feed itself cheaply. Every skill you lose becomes a product someone sells back to you. The forgetting wasn't an accident. It was a business model. And the meals I've been describing to you are the surviving proof of what we knew before we were taught to forget. Which is exactly why the last recipe, the one I promised you at the very start, matters so much. I told you about a woman in rural Kentucky who kept 7 children fed on almost nothing. I found her account in a collection of Depression-era testimonies, and her secret was a dish so simple, so cheap, and so complete that when I read it, I understood why it had to be buried. She called it a skillet of gravy and bread, but it was really a system. Every single morning, she took whatever fat she'd saved from the day before, the bacon grease, the drippings, the scrapings from every pan, all collected in a can by the stove. She'd heat that fat, stir in a few spoons of flour to make a roux, then pour in water or milk if she had it, and season it with salt and pepper. In 10 minutes she had a pan of hot, rich gravy. Then she'd take whatever bread was in the house, fresh or stale, tear it up, and let those 7 children fill their bowls. It cost almost nothing because the fat was already free, saved from meals already eaten, and the flour was pennies. But here's the part that makes it the finale, the part that stopped me cold. She never let the grease can go empty, and she never let it go bad. She kept it going, day after day, adding new fat, using old fat, a continuous cycle that meant she always had the base of a hot meal on hand, no matter how bare the cupboard got. Modern people throw that grease down the drain where it clogs the pipes, and then they drive to the store and buy oil in a bottle. She understood something we were trained to forget, that the fat left in your pan after cooking is not garbage. It's the beginning of tomorrow's meal. That saved fat, spooned into a can and kept by the stove, was the single cheapest insurance against hunger that a poor family could hold, and it required no land, no money, and no special skill. Just the refusal to throw away what was already yours. I tried it. I keep a small can by my own stove now. And when I make that gravy over torn bread on a night when I don't feel like spending a dime, I think about that woman and her 7 children, and I feel like I've recovered something that was stolen from all of us, quietly, over 2 generations, while we weren't paying attention. That's the truth at the center of everything I dug up. These 25 meals weren't the food of failure. They were the food of people who knew exactly what they were doing, who could look at a nearly empty kitchen and see 3 days of dinners, who never confused being broke with being helpless. That knowledge didn't die because it stopped working. It was buried because our forgetting became somebody else's fortune, and every pot of beans, every slice of fried mush, every can of saved grease is a piece of it clawed back into your hands. If you've read this far, you're not the kind of person who takes the easy, expensive answer just because it's the one you were handed. You're the kind who wants to know the real thing, the tested thing, the knowledge that was working long before any of us were told we needed to buy our way through life. So let me ask you something specific, and I really want your answer. Of everything I laid out, which one hit you hardest? The mock apple pie made from crackers, the cake with no eggs or milk, or that Kentucky woman's grease can by the stove? Tell me in the comments which one you're going to try first, because I read every single one, and the stories you share about your own families send me down the next trail. And if you want to keep digging this up with me, stay with me here, because we're not done. There's a whole world of these lost skills left to recover. In the next one, I'm going to show you the forgotten method families use to keep butter and eggs fresh for weeks without a refrigerator, a trick I found in a 1931 household manual that I honestly couldn't believe worked until I tried it myself. We're a group of people quietly unearthing what was taken from us, one buried record at a time. Come, find the rest of it with me. If any of these meals spoke to you, there's more waiting, the exclusive continuation of this video, picking up right where I left off. Inside the Hard Time Circle, you can ask me your own questions, and I answer you myself. And you won't be alone. You truly belong here with us. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen, and you can cancel any time.